Hey everybody, welcome back to the podcast. Today I've got Paul Stanton second time. So you're a repeat offender. Thanks for coming back.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. Like to be here.
Yeah, you bet. So I'll put a link to your background down in the show notes. Instead of taking people's valuable time, they can stalk your profiles and find out more about you. But I wanted to start with sort of a recap of our earlier conversation that we just had. Tell us what you're up to with Brad Hargraves and your new course, and then we'll jump into the intersection maybe of technology, URL, and I.
Awesome. Yeah, let's do it. Happy to share. Kind of separate from my investment banking business, decided to, Brad and I really saw an opportunity. There's not a lot of great educational resources that can be, that are professionally done and practically applied to the real estate industry. You've got kind of your academic theory on one end of the spectrum where you can go to, Cornell or MIT, et cetera, and get a commercial real estate certificate. But great theory, but hard to apply kind of walking out of the classroom to a career. And on the flip side, you've got, unfortunately, a lot of snake oil salesmen in the form of like 5-year-old Instagram personalities selling, courses on how to get rich quick in real estate or raise $100 million on LinkedIn tomorrow, who have no real estate background, but, they are kind of pitching playbooks and helping provide resources. They're just resources that aren't tested or proven. So, we really focused on, taking a practical approach to education, playbooks, resources, et cetera, for folks on kind of fundamental real estate topics. And, part of that is trying to help, folks that already service the commercial real estate industry, but are outside the industry, like prop tech companies, et cetera, educate them on how commercial real estate works. That's kind of a big thing that I've seen in the industry is those folks never getting any fundamental education on like the GP-LP relationship, how money moves through the ecosystem, how asset managers think, why they are kind of the core decision makers. So, we built a course on that. We also built a course because it's near and dear to my heart and, smart capital raising, how to go from like raising on a deal by deal basis to, tapping larger checks through family offices, institutional investors. A lot of people don't make a plan for that until they absolutely need the money. So really trying to educate people on like, this is your journey through the capital markets as a real estate sponsor. But anyway, doing all of that through playbooks and both education and practical playbooks. But, the big thing that's come out of it for us that I think we're most excited about is just the chance to build community. I think people are craving community to kind of learn together, to share best practices. In tech, like in startups, you see community everywhere where entrepreneurs, especially early stage entrepreneurs, can access all kinds of communities to help them, lean on each other, grow their businesses, et cetera. And that really doesn't exist in real estate. So we see a big opportunity there, but it's not just online. I think with any of these communities now, you have to really focus on both the IRL and, as you call it, the URL to, create something that's engaging. So, it's been super exciting. It's been a really big year on that side of my world. And, we'll kind of see where that goes.
Yeah, it's awesome. I'm so excited for it because innovation and the startup ecosystem in real estate is something that's been missing, right? I'm 24 years into entrepreneurship, and the last 14, I've been sort of looking and trying to find opportunities inside of commercial real estate. And here we are, sort of 5 years post COVID, and there's opportunities everywhere. So whether it's workplace experience, OpCo, PropCo, even the brokerage side, reimagining assets, right? That's one thing that I wanted to talk to you about a little bit. You see it at the top of the headline, it's, repurposing a tower in a CBD. But the reality of that is maybe there is a residential play for something that's more suburban, or adaptive reuse and taking advantage of some of the sunk carbon and infrastructure that's in place. So what other kind of assets have you seen that are sort of opportunities in that new classification that's coming out that people have an opportunity to participate in assets?
Yeah, I mean, I like to think of it through kind of a first principles perspective and following where, I think real estate oftentimes lags innovations elsewhere across humanity, to make a very broad generalized point. But like, when you think about like home affordability is a big place where people are innovating right now and trying to find an elegant solution. There's like rent to own and HEIs and co-investment and co-living and a lot of different solutions that have emerged to try and solve for this home affordability thing. One solution that I think is really interesting that I've seen a few smart groups approaching are residential ground leases. It's kind of a polarizing topic because the idea of some big institutional owner owning the land underneath your house, maybe doesn't feel so great. But the idea that the home really is a bundled product, right? It's like the land, it's the construction, and then it's the right to live there. If you unbundle that and you allow Americans to sell off when they're purchasing a home, immediately sell off the land such that it reduces their down payment or reduces their monthly payment, but they're still able to own the physical structure, which is what most people think of as a home. I think that's a big opportunity. And there's people can start to prove out that behavior for folks the same way people got used to, they didn't understand what a mortgage was, but it just became socially acceptable to get a mortgage. Similarly, I think if it became socially acceptable to not own the land underneath your home, that will be a really big opportunity to make, the ability to purchase a home much more affordable for, a large percentage of the population.
Totally.
Some other things on the housing side, continue to see more fragmentation in a good way around designing housing specifically for folks like, I know you're focused with a lot of your initiatives in the North Carolina, well, just generally your initiatives around, housing for civil service workers, I think traveling nurses, et cetera. I think there's massive opportunity, win-win opportunities to provide, more furnished, move-in ready, shorter term leases, for those types of folks that need access to housing for a more transient lifestyle. And there's a lot of, and that kind of avoids a lot of the regulatory risks around true short-term rentals. So I see more and more opportunity in that space for folks that can pioneer there. Obviously, from something else I know you're passionate about, but is offsite, construction practices and being able to bring panelized construction, et cetera, especially, in areas now like California, like fireproof materials that are panelized that can come in and take advantage of like shortened permitting periods. I think there's a lot of opportunities for the OpCos that can deliver that, potential OpCo, PropCo opportunities. And then, some other things that I'm seeing that are kind of out there, but I think are really interesting. I'm seeing surf park developments come into play, the ability to build these beautiful lagoons, similar to ski when the chairlift entered the mountains, right? Like you were able to just put this infrastructure in, and then suddenly all the real estate around it became really valuable. Now the wave and lagoon technologies have become so advanced that you can create really, really efficient, beautiful wave parks that are both highly profitable, have high operating margins, but also create a ton of value in the land around them, and bring, from my personal view, bring a sport that is really important to so many people's lives, because it is being in the ocean and being in the water and like flowing on a wave is one of the biggest natural highs you can get. So I think like making that more accessible to people that aren't just wealthy, that have access to ocean communities, is kind of a one-off property. But anyway, that's just, a quick kind of mixed bag of stuff.
No, that's awesome. I appreciate that, because so many things come to mind, right? The land lease piece for pathways communities and what we're working on is a big part of it. If the product that we put out is going to let the tenancy participate in the upside of equity, then it would have to be a land lease, because what we're trying to do is lock in some stability. And, that helps us. If they participate in the equity of the structure, but don't have exposure to the equity of the land, then that helps us sort of spread out our investment over a longer period of time. That's borrowed from the pages of Habitat for Humanity, right? And then if we're going to spread it out over time, we have to build it better, which means that we can't go with a traditional cardboard box build from the affordable side of inexpensive townhomes and affordable housing. We have to build it right, which means we need more capital and different ways to look at things like building science and industrialized offsite construction, where the building is actually performing to standards that we put in place, geothermal standards or noise, sound, indoor air quality, all that stuff, because the asset manager is going to need that building to perform for 50 years, not 20 or 10, because the GPLP agreement will be different. So it's just interesting how all of that changes, which leads me to the part that is required to make all of that work. It's money, right? So how about the money products? Have you seen any innovation in financing? Do you see any future innovation in financing? I know that we have a different administration in the White House now. There's a lot of economic conversations going on. There's new technologies associated with digital and global economies. Have you seen any innovation or any new discussions around the traditional versus the new emerging types of capital stacks?
Yeah, I mean, we could kind of take it from kind of along a spectrum of opportunities. And one thing, there's a lot of stuff to unpack here. I think there's some interesting forces at play. A lot of the young folks, call it 38 to 50, who have been, who are relatively senior at the big asset managers, the big private equity real estate funds, are realizing that the carry in their current fund has gone to zero because there's a lot of distress in there, right? So if they've ever wanted to leave and go start something new, it's now. And so I can tell you, just because of my seat in the ecosystem, I end up getting a ton of those folks coming to me and talking to me about, because then when they decide that they're going to leave, they realize that they can't compete with Blackstone, Ares, et cetera, in the traditional food groups, in just buying up distressed multifamily, industrial, et cetera. So they've got to go into the niches, and a lot of them are leaning into new asset classes. Anything that has operational complexity is viewed as like people can commonsensically realize that, like, if the operator has to roll up their sleeves and do a lot of work to enhance the yield, then that feels like the right sacrifice in order to get a couple hundred basis points more of yield from a traditional asset that you could just buy sitting behind your desk. So there are I think a lot of those folks who are looking, like I said, new asset classes, operationally complex business models, so leaning into OpCo, PropCo models. And so I'm cautiously optimistic that you're going to see a lot of smart people going off, starting their own funds, raising money from LPs that they've already built relationships with, to kind of move into these newer and emerging asset classes that better match the needs of some of these folks, like we talked about, like civil service housing, senior housing, or different senior housing models, more workforce housing, et cetera. And so those folks, they'll just move to the fringe of where the institutions invest, because that's where they'll find their alpha. So I think that's going to start to fund some of these more emerging but still relatively institutionalized asset classes. And then for some of the newer sponsors, I see so many folks who are coming from like the tech world, who have in many cases made a lot of money in tech and are now moving into real estate, who are just learning to navigate the capital markets for the first time. And they're realizing that they can't really tap institutional capital until they've got a track record, and until in many cases their asset class has a track record. So, it's my opinion that I think there's going to be a flood of retail capital that these folks start to unlock once they figure out the right way to do it. I don't think it's just Instagram ads flashing, 21% IRRs to accredited investors. But I think it's more thoughtful approaches to like content marketing and education around what people are doing, building an audience, educating that audience of retail investors, and then being able to convert that audience into, selling them a product, which is a security, but, getting them, comfortable with buying that security. So I think there's a lot that can be done through just leveraging the digital infrastructure we have in place and best practices of consumer marketing to start tapping a larger network of retail investors. I personally, that's not what I do in my day job, but I think that's a really interesting way that, a lot of these new and emerging concepts, and especially earlier stage sponsors, are going to access capital. And then lastly, kind of furthest down the chain is, crypto, and both a combination of leveraging blockchain technologies and being able to provide opportunities to invest with cryptocurrencies. If the trends that we're seeing continue around Bitcoin and more adoption of cryptocurrencies, more and more people are going to become millionaires every day. And real estate is a great way to hedge kind of the potential volatility of a cryptocurrency. I mean, there really is no better way to hedge it than by investing it into an IRL tangible asset. So I think being able to access some of those, newly minted crypto millionaires, but then also being able to, acquire assets with cryptocurrencies will, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. The right rails need to be put in place. But, obviously with blockchain, the transparency that will come with that, I think, is something that's sorely needed in the real estate community. Just that, a lot of people that have traditionally made a lot of money or still have a lot of money tied up in real estate probably don't want to see that happen too quickly. So, I'm not going to guess when the adoption happens, but I would say this time, 5 or 6 years from now, I believe crypto will be, a meaningful currency in the real estate ecosystem.
Yeah, that gets my tail wagging because I've been on this journey for 5 or 6 years. So I have a slightly different timing and delivery perspective, but we'll save that for later
Well,
because I want to.
I'd welcome your opinion there because you know much better than I do. So you'll
Yeah,
only
well,
make
let's
me
double
smarter.
click. We'll get back to it because I do want to talk about it. It's the number 7 market cap asset in the world is Bitcoin. So we'll get into that in a minute. But I want to double click on agentic AI and the difficulty with operational complexity because I think that's just like anything else. It's like when you found gold and it was at the surface, the complexity was to mine the gold, was to get it out, right? So you find an asset that at the surface might work, but the complexity of getting that to work, the OpCo PropCo model is the point, right? So we have agentic AI now. We've got smart contracts. We've got robotic process automation. We can start to create workflows. So it's really an amazing new dawn in terms of operating, the difficulty of operating an asset. It's actually becoming easier. And that's what's so interesting about it is that the heavy lift is understanding that intersection between IRL and URL and having people that can understand how to speak the language, truly code the language to make the workflow work, right? Between you and me and 20 other really smart people sitting around the room, we could talk through the entire deal. We could do an event model and we could talk through the entire operating side of it if we had an asset manager in the room. But getting it to do it, right? That's the hard part, and training the model to work. So I think that it's fascinating to me that the layer of what AI will do with smart contracts and how AI can help us get to an agentic design and get to the operational complexity to start to simplify the operational complexity. Like that's here. Um, and it's not that speed at which that goes is not gonna it's not a Wall Street speed. It's not quarterly. I'm seeing this change. Like I go to bed, I wake up, it's different, right? So like 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365, you got to get rid of that. It's always working and it's multiplicative in terms of its use case or in terms of its benefit. So let's talk about that a little bit. Like, is that the future developer, right? Is that the future URL developer? Is that the programmer that can see operational complexity and simplify it?
It's so big and it's so hard for at least for my brain to like quantify not quantify the opportunity because I know where I have a sense of where it all lands. It's just like, how does it build upon itself, like, sequentially? I mean, I think today the only thing you can do, I mean, what I really like about AI is that it requires you can't just like apply it to an organization. You can't just be like, here's the 10 tools that somebody needs to use. It's a combination, it's really just learning. It's individual learning with machine, right? So like anybody that's not spending their days looking at everything on their to-do list and thinking, can ChatGPT or some other AI tool make this more efficient? Because you end up just it makes you superhuman, not to sound too cheesy, but you can start doing tasks so much faster and solving problems. But it has to be like with your own workflows and then applying them to team workflows. So I think like ultimately for me, it's really hard to uh think through like how this affects the industry as a whole because I think it's going to happen at such an individual level where you're going to have real estate entrepreneurs solving problems in new ways and then applying those problems and using them to operate more efficiently and do things more efficiently, and then all of that's just going to compound on itself. So I don't know if it's just all of these like superhuman players who just all are kind of playing their own game differently from everybody else, or if there's some kind of like standardized process for asset management of certain asset classes and things like that. I'm sure it'll be a combination of the two, but I think to your point, it's going to come just so much faster than anybody thinks because it just compounds on itself every minute, every hour of every day.
And the whole world's working on it too. It's not, this isn't like something that just happens in Silicon Valley. Literally the whole world is working on it because we have distributed systems that let you and me do this together in 2 different places at the same time. So what's interesting is the utility behind blockchain requires tokens. You're talking about persistence at that point. And let's go back to crypto a little bit, because let's be honest, you're talking about capital markets, we're talking about assets, we're talking about operating assets. Every bit of it requires money, right? So even if we have all these great AI tools that are agentic and we've got operational models and workflows, if it doesn't have a payment system attached to it, and that payment system isn't persistent and interoperable, then the system itself is just a piece of technology. It's not a piece of economics. And that's something that I find super interesting that Bitcoin and the Bitcoin utility allows for on that layer, or even Ethereum and Solana, I guess the Lightning layer, but assigning tokens to it and then having a persistent system that allows for money to flow through something is sort of where we are. That's the different part. And yet a lot of people are still stuck on meme coins and altcoins, right? That's what I call the casino layer. And I have no problem with the casino layer. I enjoy going gambling, whatever, but that's not investment for me. That's fun. So the casino layer is what's taking away from people's understanding of the utility behind blockchain, and the fact that Bitcoin isn't, in my opinion, isn't even a currency. It's a security. It's a commodity.
Sure.
So, and it's got a store of value because it's scarce, right? So, and it can only be mined in certain numbers, and that the ability to mine it is actually decreasing over time, which improves its quality. So, specific to Bitcoin, I always have to sort of have that qualifying conversation first, is that when I use the word crypto, I have to say, are we talking about the utility side of currencies as a security, or are we talking about altcoins? Because President Trump just proved that he could have a text in one day with a Trump coin, right? That's not what we're talking about here as it relates to assets and investments, right?
Totally. Yeah, I mean, again, from a first principles perspective, when you compare, gold is just as arbitrary, a tangible store of value as Bitcoin, right? And so when because people, I feel like, especially real estate folks, are so hesitant to adopt something that feels so ethereal and non-traditional. But when you really understand it at its essence, it's in so many ways such a better store of value than gold. And so, and when you apply it to from a real estate perspective, the importance of properly, uh, um, documenting the millions of transactions that happen across all these assets and track records, et cetera, and you combine, cryptocurrencies and blockchain technology, and think about just overlaying them on the real estate ecosystem. I guess the scary thing for me is it can become so unbelievably efficient that the existing players and the existing operations are no longer relevant. Like, you could, if you delivered what will be the real estate ecosystem that operates on blockchain and cryptocurrencies, whether that's 3 or 5 years or whatever you think is the timeline right now, you're dealing with an entirely different world from an operational perspective than what exists in the current real estate world, specifically the real estate capital markets.
I'll give you a couple of finish lines that I see. I'm not an investment professional, but sometimes to look forward, you have to look back. There's 4 years left in this halving for Bitcoin. So to me, that's the finish line. There's 4 more years before we have our mining again. Right now, Bitcoin is the number 7 asset in the world. So if we agree that there's $900 trillion worth of assets in the world, Bitcoin's market cap is just over 2 trillion currently. And there's a lot of predictive models that say that Bitcoin, and again, I'm not the professional, I'm just going on what I know. But there's a lot of professionals that are out there from the traditional finance world that have looked at it and studied it enough to say that maybe within the next 2 years, it might be the number 3 or number 2 asset in the world, which means it goes from 2.06 trillion today to more than 3.45 trillion. So to watch something in market cap almost double in the next couple of years, and still to have it only be 2 to 3 trillion out of 900 trillion, like, to me, it seems like a very conservative estimate for it to double from 2 trillion to 4 trillion. seems pretty plausible when you're talking about 900 trillion worth of global assets, right?
Sure.
So what I think is really interesting, and I don't know that anyone has an answer for this, is how that translates directly to the coin value, to the dollar value. If it's 104,000 today at 2.06 trillion market cap, what does that mean when it goes to 3.5 trillion? Is that exponential? I think it is. And how exponential is it? I don't know. But like the reality is that it's not going to go the other way. I just don't believe that. I think people have seen the value now as a long-term store of value, and people are hodling and people are buying and they're DCAing and they're stacking and they're waiting because there's no other real good long-term stable store of value that doesn't have a massive cost to carry
Sure.
moving forward. So I think that's one of the most interesting things about it, Paul, is that I'm not from your world, but I see where it's coming and I'm listening to very, very smart people talk about it. And seeing an asset class move from 2 to 4 trillion in 4 years and double in size. So we're going to stake assets on that. We're going to be able to lend against that. I think there'll be all new products that start out of that. I think we'll have liquidity pools. I think we'll be able to lend against it. Once it goes to $4 trillion in market cap, it's a whole different animal, no?
Yeah. No, I agree. It comes with its own set of rules, and how you lend against it and assets that can be staked on it. And I think it will fundamentally. Do you know what the market cap of commercial real estate is?
I don't know what the specific to commercial real estate. I just know that the total asset market cap is considered 900 trillion.
Okay. But, I think we're going to see a world that I would argue if that's the timeline to where we see kind of widespread adoption from consumers. I mean, I still think it's viewed as a relatively niche and not widely understood concept. So the minute that turns into widely understood and from a consumer standpoint applicable to the same way that you use a credit card and you use cash, it will, because of its nature, will fundamentally reshape all the capital markets, real estate included, and that will change. And I mean, that kind of going off on a separate tangent for a second, but like, when you displace that many roles and that many jobs, let's say half the roles are no longer needed or shift to, a different skill set, and you combine that with agentic AI and what that's going to do from an operating perspective for all of these companies, there becomes, a separate, bigger question around what does our economy look like from a job perspective for folks, right? Like there's so many people who are kind of like late 30s, early 40s, making 500 grand a year at jobs that are like, they're still just moving things around and they're just waiting. They don't even know it, but they're waiting for AI to just wipe out their jobs. And if there's not some type of universal basic income in place, like you're going to see a lot of people that wake up one morning and don't have, the earning potential that they've, that has just kind of gone in a straight line since they were, 22 years old and graduated college. And I think that creates all types of crazy disruptions.
It does, and is dystopian at that point. But this is what I do know. The two things that I didn't know that I dove into. I didn't understand economics, certainly didn't understand global economics, and I didn't understand tech. But what I started realizing was when you look at $900 trillion worth of assets in the world, gold is number one at $18 trillion. So if we're going back to Bitcoin again, we're at 2 at Bitcoin, just over 2, and gold is 18. We're seeing a lot of people exit gold, but then the next 5 assets by market cap: Apple, Nvidia, Microsoft, Alphabet, and Amazon. Tech, right? So you have gold, and then you have Apple, Nvidia, Microsoft, Alphabet, Amazon, Bitcoin.
Yep.
So what the prediction is it's going to go gold, Bitcoin, Apple, Nvidia, Microsoft, Alphabet, Amazon.
Yep.
And that makes total sense because economics first, right? Tech, the fact that tech has all those assets by market cap is nuts.
Yeah.
So I think that's going to be, I think we're going to see another shift there, right? So again, the two things that I would implore people to understand or try to understand if this is dizzying to them is you've got to understand how economics works and you've got to understand how technology works currently or even in the past first to reorient yourself on what this future economy looks like. Because I think we're going to see a global virtual currency and a global virtual economy. And I think no one knows really what that looks like. We're talking about time traveling. But I really do believe that we're going to start to operate new markets and see new products and see new opportunities of that crazy world that I just spoke of in 4 years.
Yeah. And I think that begs the argument too. I think, when you look at the real estate capital markets right now, most of the access to large funding sources, i.e., institutional investors, lies in the U.S. Right? There's certainly there's the really big asset managers that have moved into other first world nations. That Brookfield is invested in other first world markets outside the U.S. As is Blackstone, as are kind of all the big asset managers. Traditionally, a lot of the funding for real estate assets lies and stays within the U.S. Other markets, they have high net worths, they have family offices, they have pension funds, et cetera, et cetera. But a lot of the big institutional investors sit here in the US. But when you think about that access to a global capital base, there are historically so many smart sponsors and GPs and developers have stayed within the US because they know for scale that's where they need to be. Like, because they know that they can't go to private equity real estate funds and go pitch a deal in Buenos Aires because there's just no appetite for that. But if you can unlock capital on a global scale for real estate projects, suddenly it opens up innovation into all of these new markets. So, I think that creates a strong argument for, if you believe from a first principles perspective that these capital markets are going to be more globally accessible, then the smartest people right now will be starting to look at opportunities outside the US and in second and, in some cases, third world countries, understanding all the culmination of what could happen over the next 3 to 4 years.
Well, Paul, because one Bitcoin equals one Bitcoin. And that's what's so amazing. There is an arbitrage opportunity when it goes into currency in that current market. So before the show, you were asking me about recovery in Helene. We'll stay along that same conversation about opportunity. When we were discussing that, we were talking about how approachable and affordable some of this property is in Appalachia. And yes, people are still healing, and there's a ton of recovery that needs to happen. We're 115 days in. A lot of that aid from FEMA is running out. A lot of the hotel vouchers are running out. And it's time to start thinking about rebuilding. So you've got zoning and planning, you've got land use opportunities, opportunity zones, what I'm calling pathways districts that start to weave some of this social fabric into these purpose-driven developments. Because when you're starting with nothing, you can really reimagine new things. And when you're starting with the cost of doing business being so low, it's kind of a whole new opportunity and a whole new interest where you maybe have your capital stack set in something like Bitcoin that is going up. It's seeing 60% returns year over year, right? So long-term play on that. If you're staking the current and the future continues to increase in value, I mean, now you have an asset that performs, that has an IRR, but you also have the currency that supported it, or the liquidity, or the lending, the whole capital market behind it is not necessarily the capital market that we play on Wall Street. It's all of a sudden Bitcoin.
Sure.
So that blows my mind because it gets multiplicative, right? The people who stake at the beginning are going to continue to probably see massive gains. Whereas before, we were just looking for stable bonds.
Right.
Like stability was good. Now we might stake in just the very money that we staked in might be worth 60% more, let alone the asset. It gives us so much more flexibility to be purpose driven, right?
Yep. Yeah. No, it's a really good point. Yeah, because you're not just playing on the margin anymore.
Right. And controlling your costs still becomes part of that. Obviously you want to deliver a project on time and under budget, but it gives you a little bit more leeway to start thinking about purpose, and some of our pathways trails, as we sort of touched on at the beginning, were, attainable. So removing the stigma of affordable housing, creating attainable, sustainable solutions is what I call it, but maybe building more towards the middle where we have civil service. 911 calls went to firefighters One of the things that drives me crazy in LA, the starting firefighter makes 50 grand a year. They're going to go put out a $6 million fire times 10,000 of them, right? So it's pretty amazing how there's sort of two economies operating in one community. So let's talk about that for a little bit. Do you see any opportunity there in trying to create stability in housing, outside of just what the private equity groups are doing and buying single family homes and renting them back? There maybe you don't have an answer. I don't know.
What do you mean by stability in housing?
So I think I'm still searching for these words too, but if you have financial acuity, you know that 25% of your gross income should be no more than 25% should go to rent. The problem is that rent continues to increase at a rate that's higher than 25% or 7%. It's higher than inflation. So even if you're in the middle, the missing middle, and you have a $55,000 a year salary, year over year, you're either moving every year to stabilize your rent or you're just going to have to pay the increase. So how can we create some stability and some predictability in that tenancy for a longer period of time so that civil servants can participate in the upside of saving and being more financially responsible? Right now, we just tell them to go do other jobs, build decks, paint on your days off, have a side hustle. That's what we tell our firefighters.
Sure.
And they make more money in their side hustle than they do saving lives.
Yeah.
So that's not sustainable. We can't keep telling them that, I don't think. I want good firefighters. I want good cops. I want good teachers. I want good nurses. I think that they shouldn't have to worry about stable rent, personally. I'm just saying I think they deserve better.
Totally.
So is this an opportunity for us to do some purpose-driven development?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. I think the answer lies somewhere in public-private partnerships, right? And just thinking out loud, there are a lot of people who to take, jobs at universities, right? Because they provide university housing and there's food and there's housing and you're able to, every dollar goes a lot farther that comes in because it's not going into rent in many cases. You're accessing a cafeteria and things like that. And those are, some of those are public universities, right? And some of those are private universities. So, that infrastructure, my knee-jerk reaction without having really ever spent any time thinking about that, I do think that there is a role for, public infrastructure projects that look more like university models, right? Where you're able to provide housing and provide some type of food stipend and things like that, allow for a lifestyle that you can't afford. Some people, that's what they prioritize in life, is not having to think about those things and just have, whatever they're making as kind of spending money. So, $55,000 for a fireman doesn't sound like a lot of money. But when you consider it in light of, they've got, room and board kind of paid for, and they get access to, some type of, better food system or whatever it is, or they just have other stipends in place, you might incentivize, higher quality, not that we need higher quality firemen, but you're going to make that a more viable career choice for a lot of people and allow them and make it optional to have to, if someone wants to earn even more and wants to pick up a side hustle, whatever that is, maybe they learn drop shipping on Amazon or
Sure.
whatever, they can learn that and they can have those financial acuity resources like you're talking about. But at the end of the day, if they just want to provide for their family through some type of public job with public infrastructure, I think that's the answer. But and now that it comes out of my mouth, I'm kind of surprised that that hasn't existed more, because it's a win-win for a lot of opportunities. Would love to build those projects and get paid fees to build them. Our tax dollars are going in so many places that are so wasteful, repurposing them. I'm not saying, I'm certainly not one for, growing our taxes, but, if we can repurpose them a little bit more intelligently, and maybe that means leveraging AI in certain ways to, to improve kind of our public infrastructure and our public operations, some of that might be repurposed into just, better public infrastructure for the people to service the community.
Yeah, and that's part of the redefinition of infrastructure too. We go to roads and bridges so much when we talk about infrastructure, but the reality is that, it's modern infrastructure is totally different. It's our energy system, our energy grid. It's the way that we share information. It's accessing, digital acuity or digital equity, how we access this, right? Not everybody has the ability just to get online with a new latest and greatest computer that can process this conversation. Uh, um, the education system, how we deliver our education, and create curiosity. I think everybody at this point in America, just like we can cross roads and cross the country, I think everybody should be able to access Google, and I think everybody should be able to be curious and use that as a tool to learn. And that infrastructure, I think, is coming. Let's switch gears just a touch towards the end of this conversation, and it's just to talk about age in place too, right? Because we've spent so much time talking about residential because I think this is where the opportunity is. It's not necessarily work, it's just sort of live. We've got $200 trillion worth of borrowed debt in Medicare and Medicaid. So we've borrowed our kids' future as it relates to retirees. It costs a lot to get sick and get old these days. So another thing associated with purpose-driven real estate and purpose-driven development can be age in place, where we can create a multifamily housing community that could potentially allow for folks to have some autonomy. And I'm not talking about, taking on the convalescent side of things. I'm just talking about like the active lifestyle is not for you. You're not quite ready to go into a home yet. What's the other option? It's still just multifamily. It's just an apartment. So wouldn't it be interesting if there could be some purpose-driven development around age in place?
Yeah, I mean, when you say age in place, but before I share any opinion, what do you think the pain points are currently for age in place? Is it a liquidity issue for seniors who want to continue to stay in homes but don't have access to liquidity to pay to stay alive, get their medicine, do all of these things? Is it social issues? Is it accessibility from the sense of like how we're developing our physical structures? Like I'm curious what I mean. I think there's some answers that says all three of those things and probably others, but what what do you see as kind of the core pain points when it comes to age in place?
Yeah, some of the statistics are pretty ugly. A lot of our aging community doesn't even have $1,000. They can't withstand $1,000 hit. So I probably come from maybe have a different perspective on this, but most of our aging and elderly, they lack the financial resources to enter into, let alone the accessibility to that housing, right? So I think those are sort of two of them. The other part of it is that, health and mobility issues. What ends up happening with age in place folks is if they're retired, they just go hit Medicare or Medicaid, which costs the taxpayers a ton of money because when they could be living in an apartment for call it $1,000, a studio apartment, they're living in assisted living under Medicare or Medicaid and it's 6,000. But they don't really need that level of care yet. It's just sort of the only other option there is in the system. They can't, free market economics doesn't allow them access to something attainable because there's no product on the market. So they rely on Medicare and Medicaid, which taxes the taxpayer. And then into assisted living they go, maybe early.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. I just had my last year, my last grandparent pass away, and she was, I saw that the biggest thing for her was a liquidity issue. I got to the point where she wanted to stay in her house, but at some point she was going to run out of money, and then my parents were happy to support, but then at some point they needed to hire somebody to live with her, et cetera, et cetera. And a big piece of that too was just social for her. She was, even though she was 93, her brain was sharp. Physically, she was fine. She really died because she lost the will to live because she was so just unhappy. And she's a very social person. And, I do think, and she lived in a 55 and over community, but she had aged out of that 55 and over community. So I think what my knee jerk reaction to that would be, there's something that needs to be beyond the 55 and over community that is not, as you said, assisted living that, is going to suck $6,000 per person per month from taxpayers' pockets to cover that when it really isn't necessary. But if you did have a more collegial dorm lifestyle, I mean, obviously you need to be cognizant of they're not going to run up and down steps or,
Right.
but like having a common space where people are spending time together, but they're still human. They're given the autonomy to like not feel like they need to be watched over. the RA role becomes suddenly something that's more of a caregiver role, but it's just there to kind of like oversee and make sure nothing goes too wrong. But I mean, I do think that there's something there, and it's been filled by private nursing homes that are terrible and depressing. So if you look to history to think through, like, what are the solutions? We have evolved, like, we've gone from multifamily housing to then like segment that out into student and senior and, workforce. And now I think it's just, as there was that one branch and then three branches went off that, there's three branches that go off each of those and have more bespoke housing that is user driven, right? For a lot of these different people, and is way more efficient. We did a deal this year. It was uh, can't announce it yet because it is under LOI, but it's in the IDD space, intellectually and developmentally disabled folks. And those were folks that were previously people with autism and Down syndrome. I've got a Down syndrome cousin. She can do everything. Like, she does not need, like, in the 90s, the 80s and 90s, those folks were put into institutions.
Right.
And that was horrible for them. It was a horrible quality of life. But B, they did not need that level of care. Like, these people need help getting to work and getting to school, and in some cases, in more extreme cases, like getting dressed and taking their medicine. But that does not require the taxpayer dollars, and it's a lose for the individual. So now that we've moved to more group based housing, and it's very much just like a bunch of roommates living together with someone supervising, like, I think more of those models need to evolve for the folks that they can benefit the most.
Yeah, I love that you brought that up because emotional and psychological factors are so important when you talk about age in place. My buddy Kelly Cologne, I'm not sure if you're connected with Kelly, but she, Elidex Consulting, she's working on neurodiversity and what it means to incorporate neurodiverse thinking into better design for the future, more purpose driven than ADA handles and, pull handles and compliance and levers and that kind of stuff, not physical design, but really sort of more emotional and social constructs. Well, Paul, this was great, man. We did it again. You bent my mind for a little while. I always appreciate the conversation. I'm super excited for what you and Brad are doing. I love that you're sort of peeling back that layer of that onion, right? Creating sort of a unique place to be creative and explore in real estate in a safe place where you can kind of peel back one layer and people will have both a mentor and maybe a guide associated with what they can do as they progress. What's the name of your school product so I can have it in here or
Sure,
maybe a
it's
link
thesis
to it?
driven courses, courses.thesisdriven.com.
Yeah, courses.thesisdriven.com. So I'll put that in the liner notes for sure. Anything we missed? Anything else you want to talk about?
No, I mean, I could sit here for another hour and especially have you educate me on blockchain and crypto, because I still feel like a preschooler when it comes to this corner of the world that I think will, is going to have such a massive effect. But as always, this is always a fun conversation, especially when you feel like it ended too soon.
Yeah, well, let's see what happens, right? The good news is that we timestamped this. I always love going back to my conversations and seeing if they aged well. 2.06 trillion in market cap is Bitcoin, number 7 in the world as of today. It's 104,000, I think it was before the call this morning, this afternoon. So Ethereum is at like 3,300, Solana was at like 250. So it'll be interesting to see how this ages. We'll look at it again in a couple months. We'll do it again for sure, because as you continue to evolve and emerge with what you're doing with your thesis driven courses and what I'm doing with Pathways communities, I think we're going to converge at some point. So we'll just get back together and have another conversation when there's another breakthrough.
Sounds good, man. Always enjoy it.
Yeah, Paul, thank you.
Thanks, Chris.